evening and welcome to our Caroline Cymru revision sessions, the live sessions where you've got the opportunity to ask questions of us. So if you've got any questions, then please put them into the question and answer facility on the top right of the screen. And hopefully throughout the session, even myself and Mr. Dagton will stop and have a look at the questions and help you out and see what questions you've got. That might be on anything to do with what we presented on previously or anything to do with option 8 in Unit 1. It's your call. So my name is Mr. Andrew Morell, and I'm a history teacher at Ysgol Uwchradd Llanidloes High School, teach history and government and politics. And you will have seen that across the last 4 sessions online, we've had 2 sessions that focus on the significance in changes in international relations from 1890 to 1939, and then 2 sessions on the impact of the Russian Revolution as well, 1905 to 1945. I went through the first 2 sessions and Mr. Dagton did the second 2 sessions. So, just to remind you, this in terms of content is focusing on Europe in the age of conflict and cooperation. Now, as we've said in the videos online, that if you don't study this option, then this revision video, this revision session, live session, won't be particularly useful for you. But there are a number of videos on the Caroline Cymru recording section which focus more on exam technique and how to cope with content. And so as a result, if you use them, then you'll get a really good sense of some of the skills needed, reviews of good essays, which will serve you well no matter what one of these 8 options you're currently doing at AS History. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recap some of the tasks we did during our sessions online and recap some of the ideas so that we know what it is that we're thinking about. And if at any of these points a question crops up in your mind, then please don't hesitate to post it in that question and answer function, and hopefully we'll catch it and be able to answer it. So we started our discussion of European international relations between 1890 and 1939 by looking at this thing, the context essentially being these countries that didn't like the idea of any other country being bigger and more powerful than it. Because quite simply, in a fight, if they weren't sure that they were bigger and more powerful than the other country, they weren't sure they were going to win, they weren't really going to engage in that fight. And so from Otto von Bismarck in the 1870s, this was the idea to keep peace in Europe. So the main countries at this time were Russia, under the Tsar, Austria-Hungary, or Austro-Hungarian Empire, however you want to call it, under its emperor, the Ottoman Empire, France, Germany that'd been united under Otto von Bismarck in 1871, and of course the UK as well. Now all the other countries at this time were all the other little countries, you know, are in alliances with other countries, other major powers, these main powers here. So the idea of this was that if a country was distinctly more powerful than another country in Europe, then war was more likely to happen because they wouldn't be afraid of losing that war. However, if Russia, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, France, Germany and the UK were roughly equal in strength, the idea, the thought, was that they wouldn't go to war with each other because they wouldn't be sure that they'd win that war. And that, as a result, kept the balance of power in Europe. And this balance of power then was in some eyes improved and some eyes not improved by things like alliances. Now these alliances took the form of many things. You had, for example, the League of the Three Emperors between the German Emperor, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor and the Russian Emperor as well. And them working together, agreeing to work together, is one way in which they thought they'd be able to neutralise the threats of other countries as well. You also had some specific alliances as well. You had the Dual Alliance. Now, the dual alliance was between Germany, and I'll start to highlight so then we can see Germany and Austro-Hungary. What's left of it today, this area of land here. And this dual alliance was those countries working together, promising to work together in the face of particularly French opposition. This then became the Triple Alliance, which in time included Italy as well. Don't know why. There we go. It's colouring again there. Which included Italy as well. At another time, then we had the French-Russian alliance. Now, as I said, the dual alliance in some ways was created in order to pose a bit of a threat, to act as a bit of a counterbalance to the threat from France in particular. Well, the French-Russian alliance then, signed between France and what was then Russia, most of this area, the dual alliance, which then merged into the triple alliance as well. Now, weirdly, strangely, the French-Russian alliance in some ways was anti-British in intent as well. France and Russia saw lands, particularly down this area here as the Ottoman Empire was decreasing, which Britain was competing for as well. So to top this off again, we had another thing called the Entente Cordiale. Don't think cordial like you put in your drink. Think cordial like cordial relations, right? Friendly relations, the Entente Cordiale, signed between Britain and France. It's been a bit slow, isn't it, with my colouring? Now, the idea of this was, again, to create a counterbalance to the threat from Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy as well. The idea as well is it would end colonial rivalries in this area here in Northern Africa. At this point, Britain and France were competing over places like Tunisia and Egypt, and this settled that disagreement as well. Now, in time, this merged to create, as you can almost tell from the red already, this merged to create the Triple Alliance. Now, the Triple Alliance then posed an opposite, a force to be reckoned with against the German and Austro-Hungarians and Italians in their Triple Alliance. Now, in some ways, this does preserve the peace. It preserves the peace because you're binding certain countries closer together. In being an alliance between France and Britain, you're saying we, France and Britain, are not going to go to war. Same, Russia and France, or Germany and Austria-Hungary, or Austria-Hungary and Italy. We are saying we are not going to go to war with each other. However, the problem arises when you've got these opposing alliances, when they're done almost in a defensive way against the other countries or the other alliance. And you will know from doing your studies that by the time we get to the First War in 1914, it is Britain, France and Russia versus Germany and Austria-Hungary. So you can see in that you've got your alliances potentially leading to conflict as well. That cooperation between countries ultimately leading to confrontation. So what were the main reasons for the First World War? Well, hopefully you'll remember these as militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now, militarism, quite simply, was the build-up of armed forces. The build-up of armed forces by countries in some sort of arms race, as they're slowly increasing the size of their navies, in the size of their air forces, or limited air forces this time, but nonetheless, or the size of their armies themselves. Alliances are what we just discussed. Now, what's interesting about these alliances if it'll let me go back, it will let me go back, is that we missed one specific country here, didn't we, in the form of the Ottoman Empire. Now I need to change my highlighter colour because the Ottoman Empire eventually ended up on the side of Italy, Austria-Hungary and Germany. The trouble was for the Ottoman Empire, at this point, the Ottoman Empire was declining. It was declining in its ability to govern itself, in its ability to keep the peace within the different kinds of communities that were within that. And so as a result, you begin to see this alliance leading to a weakness on this southern border. And then you see Britain, France and Russia trying to fill that power vacuum more so than the countries that are close by, like Austria-Hungary and Italy, which leads potentially to more conflict as it happens. Imperialism, quite simply, is they're looking to gain territorial land across the waters in other countries, in other continents. And Africa became the real focus of imperialism at this time. The so-called scramble for Africa occurred at this point. Now you'll have seen in my session the map of the scramble for Africa, which shows Africa literally carved up between these European powers. Huge swathes of it owned by France, huge swathes of it owned by Britain, and other countries digging in and taking their own sections as well. You've got places like Italy taking control of Somaliland. You've got Italy taking control of Libya, Belgium taking control of the Congo, places like that. And so this provides some sort of a pressure release, because disagreements between, say, Britain and France could find a pressure release outside of the European continent. But what it also does is it leads to more conflict as well, because they are literally scrambling for the same areas of land. And by 1914, there was only one country in Africa that wasn't under colonial control, and that was Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was called then. Every other country in Africa, every other swathe of land that we now call countries and define as countries, had been taken over by European powers. So the scramble had come to its head there. It was no longer, it's all right, we'll ignore gathering land in that area and go to this area instead, because that area had almost certainly been captured by another European power by this point. And nationalism links quite closely. Nationalism is that link to imperialism, because imperialism makes the country seem strong and powerful. And that's what nationalism is about, the appearance that the country is strong and powerful. So, in my session, then we rattle through, we look to see who was to blame for the First World War overall. But what ultimately I wanted us to do was to have a look at this in terms of our specific revision tasks to help us with our thinking. So it's very easy for us as AS level historians to think that the Treaty of Versailles was the only peace treaty, or if not the only, the main treaty that settled the peace after the First World War. Well, in many ways, it is incredibly important, because it settles the peace with Germany. And having studied this topic, where you look at the rise of national socialism in Germany, you've seen the impact of the Treaty of Versailles and the Weimar government, etc. But it is not the only peace treaty, and also in some ways, some historians have even suggested it wasn't even the harshest of the treaties either. So we looked at the four other peace treaties that were signed. We looked at the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which was between the Allies and Austria. We looked at the Treaty of Trianon, which was between the Allies and Hungary. The treaties of Sèvres and Lausanne, which were treaties with the Ottoman Empire, or what was left after the Ottoman Empire, and the Treaty of Rapallo, which was signed with what had then become the USSR, the Soviet Union. So what I wanted you to do in terms of a revision task here is I wanted you to think and compare directly between these treaties to think which country fared worse. Was it Germany? Was it Germany, the one we automatically think of as being the one that fared worse, or was it another country, another treaty? So the Treaty of Versailles led to the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, the colonies that Germany had in Africa, and the demilitarization, of the Rhineland. So significant, the loss of territorial lands in present-day Namibia, present-day Tanzania, are huge losses to Germany at the time. But did any of the other four treaties have harsher articles than this? Well, both the Treaty of Saint-Germain and Trianon, both of them forced the country to split in half because it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Treaty of Saint-Germain signed with Austria, Treaty of Trianon signed with Hungary, split these into two. The Treaty of Sèvres-en-Lussagne saw Turkey, or what was left of Turkey, only able to claim Turkish lands. So the Ottoman Empire at the time had land in North Africa, the Middle East, but now it could only, what was left of the Ottoman Empire, could only have the land which was Turkey. Whilst the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with, Treaty of Rapallo, which replaced the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, potentially improved land for Russia. What about armed forces then? Well, the Treaty of Versailles limited the German army to 100,000 men. It meant that the German Navy could only have 6 battleships and that there was no air force allowed. However, pardon me, it wasn't the harshest of the peace treaties. The reason being is that the Treaty of Saint-Germain said there could only be 30,000 volunteers. For doing it for free, aren't you? These are people who aren't paid to be in that army, they're volunteering to do it. And they weren't allowed any navy whatsoever. So, arguably, Austria was treated much worse than Germany in terms of the demobilisation of its armed forces, of ridding themselves of their armed forces. Well, still harsher than the Treaty of Versailles, but not quite as harsh, was the Treaty of Trianon, which limited the Hungarian army to 35,000. So slightly bigger than the Austrian army. What about reparation payments? Now, you'll have seen in looking at the rise of National Socialism that burden that the 132 billion marks worth of reparations placed on Germany and its ability to build its economy under the Weimar government. Well, in terms of war damages, what you'd see is that in the Treaty of Saint-Germain, Austria went bankrupt before they could settle how much their reparation payments were going to be. So if we're thinking about harshness, well, the harshness must be that this country has gone bankrupt before they even settle those reparation payments. And in terms of blame, well, all of the treaties, Saint-Germain, Trianon and Sèvres-en-Lussagne, all blame the countries respectively for their part in the war, for beginning the war. So arguably, if I was you, I would be arguing that the Treaty of Saint-Germain was the harshest of the treaties. Next then, what I wanted us to do in terms of a revision task was to make a T-chart. Now, a T-chart that thinks and focuses specifically on the Locarno era. One side that says it was genuine peace, and another side that says it was an illusion. And we discussed these key terms when we were doing the revision session. Genuine peace being it was truly establishing peace, whilst the illusion being it was just on the surface. It was made to look like there was peace, but underlying deep-seated hatred still existed between the countries, and war would break out any moment. All it needed was a spark to break out. So what was it that meant that actually in some ways this was an era of genuine peace? Well, we could start probably with the Locarno treaties themselves. Now, these Locarno treaties were about acceptance of borders, acceptance of the borders between Germany and France, and it was about acceptance that the Rhineland would remain demilitarized. So in many ways, this was about genuine peace, because they were both agreeing, both France and Germany were agreeing that those lands were to remain as that. There's going to be no border conflict between the two. The Kellogg-Briand Pact as well is probably a key one here. That war was going to be for self-defense only. And that is, again, a big step forward, an effective international agreement. One thing that some people may suggest was an illusion, creating the idea that it being an illusion of peace, was instead the League of Nations. Now, it was good at solving disputes between minor powers, but its dispute resolution between major powers was really poor. In fact, to successfully solve a single dispute between major powers. An example of Italy and Abyssinia. What happened? Italy left the League of Nations. So it didn't successfully sort out a dispute between any major powers. The policy of disarmament is probably what some people would say was something that could lead this to being called an illusion of peace. Because disarmament was hoped to be the next step after the Dawes Plan and the Locarno Plan to ensure that people in Europe, especially bordering Germany, felt safe. Well, if they felt safe, they wouldn't need any more soldiers. They wouldn't need a big enough army. But when a World Disarmament Conference met in 1932 with 60 countries present, they didn't find an agreement. They didn't agree on anything. So surely, in order for it to be fundamentally recognised as an era of genuine peace, they needed to agree on the lack of use of the armed forces. But as they didn't manage to do it, well, maybe this suggests it was an illusion of peace instead. In terms of the League of Nations, you also have massive self from the key powers at the time, from Britain, France. It's have the USA involved. The only country really at this point that could have acted as that peacekeeper, that could have backed up what the League was saying. Now, you also have some massive failures of the League of Nations, particularly Italy and Abyssinia. When Italy sought to invade Abyssinia, Britain pleaded to the League of Nations to get involved. The League of Nations imposed initially moral sanctions, right? It's like a telling off that, right? Don't do it. And also economic sanctions. Now, economic sanctions were a bit harder hitting than moral sanctions, but ultimately it didn't see America stopping trade with Italy. It didn't see Italian economy suffering too badly. And ultimately what they did, quite frankly, in the end, is they left the League in 1938 anyway. And so they could no longer apply these to them. Is there anything that means that this is a genuine era of peace other than Locarno treaties and the Kellogg-Briand Pact? Well, you do have the Washington Naval Conference that did see a limit on the tonnage of ships being applied. Countries couldn't have more than a certain tonnage of naval ships. And it saw America agreeing to get rid of, to scuttle, to destroy a huge part of its navy. Sorry, a huge part of its navy. So, yeah, I mean, this could easily be a topic for an essay question as well. To what extent was the period 1919 to 1938 an illusion of peace? Well, here you go, you've started to build up your arguments either side then, haven't you? Locarno treaties and that acceptance of the border is something that means it was a genuine peaceful era, whilst the League of Nations failures was something that might mean it was an illusion of peace instead. So the last revision task that I suggested was this. For each event in the build-up to World War II, to go and give it a rating of 1 to 5 as to how close you thought it brought Europe to war. 5 being not likely at all, through to 1, which was war was inevitable and it was just waiting for that first shot to be fired. So we saw in that video whole selection, whole different series of events that was building up to war. The first was the return of the Saarland. Now that return of the Saarland was a peaceful vote. 98% of people in the Saarland voted to rejoin Germany. And so if I was you, I'd be saying for the return, I should have had a blank slide here, shouldn't I? For the return of the Saarland, I would be putting it as a 5. Reason being is because this was peaceful. This is what the people wanted. The people of the Saarland, and what was considered by the League of Nations to be a fair vote, wanted to rejoin with Germany. Now, nonetheless, it was still a step towards war because it was something that was forbidden, or at least forbidden in short term, by the Treaty of Versailles. But still, it is a step towards it. Next was the Rhineland, or the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Now that remilitarization of Rhineland does see the army being used, the army marching into somewhere that was previously unoccupied by the army, and somewhere that was specifically forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. So I would be giving it a 4, and I'd give it a 4 quite simply because Hitler made orders if they were to be stopped or challenged, that the German army was to retreat back into Germany, and Britain, quite frankly, was happy for it to do it as well. It didn't really worry either side. Now that might have been because of the policy of appeasement Britain was following, but nonetheless, it didn't really worry either side. And it was still German territory. Next event was Anschluss, that union between Germany and Austria. And I'd suggest Anschluss is definitely a move closer to war, and I'm going to give it a 3. And I'm going to say a 3 because what it did was it showed Germany provoking, actually, it showed Germany provoking some sort of discontent within Austria, then literally marching its troops across the border into a country that wasn't it, that had never been part of Germany. And as a result, then they are almost declaring war just on Austria, not world war, but a war on Austria itself. Following this, we have the issue of the Sudetenlands. Now, I may be tempted here to go back to a 3, and I'll tell you why. The reason for this, it was following largely the same pattern as Anschluss, didn't it? Right, the provocation of something that meant Hitler felt he could use the excuse of restoring law and order within the area. But I'm going to say 3 because ultimately Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, met with Churchill at the Munich conference and said, yes, you can have that land. So it wasn't likely that it was going to be a war after that. And if Hitler had just taken the Sudetenland and not done the stuff that he did after, then I think it would have been less likely for there to have been a war than Anschluss, than that union with Austria. What did it for Hitler was that invasion of Czechoslovakia. I would give a 1. The invasion of Czechoslovakia showed to the Western countries, to Neville Chamberlain and Britain in particular, that Hitler could not be trusted. He could not be trusted to keep his word, and he could not be trusted to invade country that had no real entitlement to be part of Germany. At least in Austria, they spoke German. At least in the Sudetenland, they spoke German. And so there was a claim that they were a similar nation, similar culture. Czechoslovakia was different. The German-Soviet Pact. I'm drawing all over this, apologies. The German-Soviet Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, you might have heard it called. I would suggest you could give a 2 to. Now, it was pretty serious because it saw the two powers, the Soviet Union and Germany, if we basically split up Poland And without it, maybe we wouldn't have had the invasion of Poland, which was that final spark for war. But nonetheless, I'd stick with 2 because it was an agreement between Hitler and Stalin to split an area of land up, not really posing a threat to each other. Invasion of Poland, though, you can be no clearer. It was a 1, is a 1, or is a 0 if you can get any lower than that, because it was following this that the ultimatum was sent. German soldiers, Nazi soldiers, to leave Poland, and if they didn't, then war would be declared between the 2 powers. So I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions on the question and answer facility. Okay, there are currently no questions on the question and answer facility. Please feel free to add any questions. And I think we've had a bit of internet trouble with Mr. Downton, so I will carry on and have a go at his bit, which is part of the same unit. So I know what I'm saying, I know what I'm doing, and hopefully it'll make sense, even though it's not Mr. Downton who's delivering it. So Mr. Downton looked at the Russian Revolution, the impact of Russian Revolution, and his checklist here is that you know the main causes and the effects of the 1905 revolution, the main causes of the 1917 revolution, the Civil War and the Bolshevik consolidation of power that happened afterwards between 1917 and 1924, and the impact of Stalin's political, economic and social changes up to 1945. So you're looking at a long old time period here, 1905 to 1945. It's longer than it is for Italy and longer than it is for Russia. So possible exam questions you could get for this would be things like the most significant changes in Russia in the period between 1905 and 1945 came under Lenin. Stalin's domestic policies had the most significant impact on Russia between 1905 and 1945. So things you need to be looking at here are these words like most, isn't it? Most significant changes. These are provoking that debate, aren't they? So it's undoubtable that there were significant changes under Lenin. It's undoubtable that there were significant changes in significant impacts, of Stalin's domestic policies. But were they more or less significant than other things? The lives of people in Russia were affected more by repression than by any other government action in the period 1905 to 1945. This more word is what provokes that debate again. The collectivization of agriculture had the greatest impact on the lives of Russian people in the period 1924 to 1945. These 2 questions are really similar. You could almost replace that word collectivization of agriculture with repression, and you could almost write the same thing. And how effectively did Russian governments deal with the challenge they faced in the period 1905 to 1945? Looking at the whole of that time period there, isn't it? So keywords of this: revolution, which is a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favour of a new system. Autocracy, which is a system of government by one person with absolute power over that system. The Tsar was the emperor of Russia before 1917. So the main causes of the 1905 revolution were strikes that spread across the country and illegal trade unions which had become widespread. The Grand Duke Sergei Nicholas II's uncle was assassinated near the Kremlin in Moscow, the heart of the Tsar's power. A mutiny broke out amongst the sailors on the battleship the Pometkin, and there was a general strike in October as well. Now, there are a number of long-term and short-term causes of the 1905 revolution. You could split them into long-term, those political problems, those things that were happening, people's unhappiness with the Tsar's rule and control of the country. The economic problems, things that meant that workers were so frustrated that they went on strike. And then the short-term causes as well were the defeat in the War of Japan and Bloody Sunday as well. That what started as a peaceful protest led by Father Gapon as they marched on the Winter Palace with banners referring to the Tsar as little father, and then they were shot down as a result of their protests. These are the things that sparked that revolution, as opposed to the long-term underlying things, which were the political and economic problems. What were the effects of it? Well, first effect was the October Manifesto. Sergei Witt, an influential policymaker, persuaded the Tsar to pass his October Manifesto, which they issued in 1905, and it promised large political reform, which it did to start with. A Duma, an elected national parliament, was set up. created the fundamental laws, the right to dissolve or close the Duma at any point, which Tsar Nicholas did use later on. Control. The Tsar continued to use the army and Okhrana to suppress any opposition, the Okhrana being that secret police. And Stolypin's economic reforms as well. His redemption payments, loans from the state were abolished, and loans for peasants to buy land became available with the introduction of the Peasants' Land Bank instead, to try and improve some of those conditions for the peasants, to stop those long-term economic problems still being an issue. What about the 1917 revolution? What were the causes? What were the reasons for it? Well, Tsar Nicholas II was a poor leader, and his wife Tsarina, particularly when he went out to fight and lead the troops in the First World War, his wife Tsarina took kind of domestic control back at home in Russia. And people accused Rasputin, the man pictured on the right here, of being too much of a bad influence on the Tsarina herself. Economic problems grew, made worse by Russia's disastrous involvement in World War I. There were cavalry, horses, fighting against tanks. There were soldiers running to the front without weapons. There were soldiers running to the front without ammunition, instructed to pick up ammunition and guns from the soldiers that had fallen down before them. Coupled with 300% inflation back home in Russia as well, it's had a huge impact on the economy back at home and people's happiness with the Tsar's regime. Social unrest led to the February Revolution, at which the Tsar himself abdicated and stepped down. The failure then of a government that worked in between the dual power government, half between the Duma and half between the Soviet, the failure of that led to the issuing of the October Revolution. What were the events then that set up the provisional government? Well, by 1917, the people of Russia had had enough of the Tsar. The February 1917 revolution saw demonstrations and food riots suddenly breaking out in the capital city of Petrograd. The Tsar lost control and support, particularly from the soldiers in the army. And the Tsar gave up the throne, with a provisional government being formed. And the main revolutionary parties were taken by surprise. This was a real people's revolution. They hadn't really orchestrated and organised it themselves. Instead, it was caused by sudden risings of workers and soldiers, sick of war, shortages, and consistent high prices, because of that 300% inflation. So what caused then the October Revolution, the Red Revolution? Well, dual power. The Duma working alongside where probably the real power lay, which was the Soviet. The Workers' Committee, which also saw then the parties like the Bolsheviks gaining more power. The return of Lenin was incredibly important. He'd been exiled abroad, mainly in Finland, when he returned, and he published his April thesis calling for all power to the Soviet. This sparked people's thoughts that we need to see the Soviet gain all the power and the Duma government to be left behind. The July days as well, the Kornilov affair, and ultimately the Bolsheviks seizing power through largely a bloodless coup. What they shown after to look like, well, less of a bloodless coup, but this one was a bloodless coup. 6 people, I think if I'm right in saying, 6 people were killed, 3 of which were members of the Bolshevik Party anyway, who were trying to take over. So what did the Bolsheviks do after in order to consolidate the power? Well, the civil war and the Bolsheviks engaged in the civil war. After they'd seized control from the provisional government, the Bolsheviks had to safeguard that really fragile grasp on power. They had to shore up control. And so they did this through Red Terror, through war communism, through control of the railways, and through much better leadership, really, than you saw under the Tsar. So the Cheka and the Red Terror, by 1923, there are 315 gulags across the country that held people that the Cheka had arrested. Centralisation of the Communist Party to make sure they were singing from the same hymn sheet. Propaganda and censorship. Replacing war communism with a new economic policy was a way to try and buy the support of some of the peasants. And religion, because of the vast majority were deeply religious, deeply orthodox, Lenin allowed freedom of worship and belief, while aiming ultimately to destroy the wealth of the church, to take it away. And they also educated them through indoctrination and communist ideology as well. So what were the impacts of Stalin's policies after 1945? Well, there was huge purges. The Great Terror, as it was called, saw the wipeout of most of the opposition. Collectivization saw farms being pulled together under state ownership. Now, by itself, that doesn't sound like too harsh a policy, but when you see that when peasants, mainly in Ukraine, refused to do it, and then they were forcibly moved to land elsewhere and died of starvation as a result, you can see the terror as a result. Industrialization and a 5-year plan saw huge government centralization, and social and economic impact of war was also very, very visible. Just like in the First World War, they threw everything at the war itself. So too did they in the Second World War as well. So I'll just check if there are any questions. No, there are no questions at all. So in that case, thank you very much for your listening and using this resource. And it just leaves me to say that we wish you all the very best in your History AS exam as you work hard towards that goal at the end of this year. Thank you very much.